Holy Week story, When the Human and the Holy Collide. Chapter 2.
Mother returned home from Sarah's, Jacob at her side, speechless at the story Jacob had relayed. Asher recounted that father was so mad he refused to even return home to talk to Jacob. I know what they were thinking. The stories of Jacob's juvenile behavior at the gates and the disappearance that night had already started going around their social circles. The situation would not resolve quietly. As mother left to go about her day, Jacob shuffled over to the table and grabbed a small loaf of bread. I was just ready to move past what he did and get on with the day. There were so many things that we needed to catch up on since we had spent the early morning trying to recover my brother. So I began talking about the list of things that we needed to address. Jacob had responsibilities at the barns, and I needed to check on our winter stores. As he picked at the bread on his plate, he took a deep breath in and sighed. Caused me to pause in my review of our to-do list, and that's whenever he began to tell me the rest of what happened that night. Going back to that moment amidst his childish giggles and shared elbow jabs with his friends, he recalled how this man Jesus, that they had set out to make fun of, just caught his eye. Jacob said he didn't say a word. He just looked at him and smiled as the donkey that he was riding on just kept walking through the gates. Jacob then began talking about something in Jesus' eyes that stopped him in his tracks. He knew in that moment what he was doing was wrong, and that this man deserved more respect than what he and his friends were offering. So he grabbed his friends and he pushed them back into the crowd, and they ridiculed him for stopping their fun. And as he tried to convince them to stop their antics, they quickly turned on him with an ultimatum: continue having fun at the expense of these people, or get left behind. This is where I realized something had profoundly changed for Jacob. Choosing to be left behind, my little brother, the troublemaker, the guy always up for antics, choosing respect over rowdiness at that moment? I could tell as he recalled this moment that it was just as surprising to him as it was to me. With a balanced mix of concern and intrigue, I leaned against the table and motioned for him to continue. As the people followed the donkey through the gates, Jacob got tied up in a push of the crowd. He followed the procession all the way to the temple where Jesus got off the donkey and entered the temple doors. There, among the crowd, he got drawn into conversations about Jesus and what he'd been doing around the region. He'd heard stories of miracles, of people leaving their homes and following him as disciples, of his teachings and radical stories of his godhood. Jacob was ripe for these kinds of stories. He was always about being different and shaking up tradition. I think he saw something of himself in this Jesus. Jacob decided to continue following this group as Jesus left the temple, and he journeyed with them, and he ultimately decided to stay overnight at their camp outside the city. He spent the evening hearing stories about Jesus being the prophesied Messiah, that he was the man sent to free us. At this moment, I had to stop him. It's one thing to feel some sense of camaraderie with this man, but did he not see that if someone were to be our Messiah, that surely our elders and our rabbi will know him and speak of him? That our Messiah would reach out to the most learned of his followers first and call them to be his disciples. He wouldn't spend his ministry here in the dust of the small towns and the hovels of our region, reaching out to laborers, to prostitutes, to tax collectors. Did it not mean anything to him that Father called this Jesus a blasphemer and a liar? Jacob seemed stumped. He'd been raised with the same reverence for the elders of our faith that I had. He knew that God had appointed these men to lead and to teach his people. He also knew that they did not like the waves that this Jesus guy was making among the everyday people in Jerusalem and the surrounding towns. That's when he rose from the table and he commented how he just knew something was different about this guy and that he found him interesting. He said that he saw Jesus followers, not crazy brainwashed idiots, but people seeking answers they have looked for their entire lives, and that he felt that he might get some answers himself instead of having to take Father's word. He was saying some very risky things. This could lead to much bigger issues for our family besides just his disappearance for a night. Selfishly, I couldn't help but begin to think of how this could impact my prospects. With a wayward brother, I would never be accepted among the leaders of our people. Families like Havaz would see me as a risk and take their daughters elsewhere for advantageous matches. My future at my father's side at the temple could be ruined if nobody wanted to be associated with us again. I looked at my brother and I laid out how he was going to behave from now on. Whatever this experience was for him, he had to get back in line. Talk of this Jesus had to stop because our parents wasn't going to have the patience for it. He needed to go about his responsibilities as he did before this whole event even happened. So I sent him out to go to work, and he complied, even if he seemed a little downcast as he went. Before he could exit the room, though, Father came storming in the front door. He had just come from the temple steps where he had been talking with religious leaders, just raging about the blasphemous zealot. Well, he grabbed Jacob and the both of them walked towards the table where I was standing nearby. Father was barely controlling his anger as he recounted just an hour ago that this Jesus had walked into the temple area and proceeded to knock over all the tables of the respected salesmen just doing their business in the temple. He'd yelled and screamed about them being thieves and robbers. He had dared to call the temple his house. Weeks worth of profits just lay ruined on the temple floors. Businessmen and their workers had to chase down livestock that had been broken free of their cages. The chaos was undeniable and everyone was just watching, Jew and Roman alike. Father said he and his friends knew at that moment this man needed to be taken down. He was causing too much trouble and making too many waves among the everyday Jews that swarmed this city. The Romans sure wouldn't stand for all the talk of tearing down and rebuilding kingdoms, of being the savior of the Jews, or of seeing their profits be diminished at the hand of a Nazarene upstart. I looked at Jacob. He stood there looking at Father as if he was seeing him for the first time. Hearing about Jesus' outrage seemed to kindle something within him. His eyes lit up, hearing that the status quo had been shaken so hard. He grimaced when Father referred to Jesus as a blasphemer and a liar. Observing these two men in this moment made it clear to me that the events of the last couple of days, well, they were going to stay with us for a really long time. Father finished his diatribe and looked over at Jacob. And barely controlling his rage, he looked at him in the eye and threw his hand up to keep Jacob from saying anything else. Father stormed out of the room, and he just left us there in silence. I turned to Jacob. He looked at me, sighed, and he walked out the door. Little did I know, this was just the beginning.
I tasked Marcus with the job of finding my men. I knew he wouldn't come back until he'd either found the men and brought them back, or confirmed they were dead. At that point, I'd have almost preferred the latter. They'd embarrassed my family and brought ridicule to my name. If they showed up again, they sure wouldn't be afforded the positions they'd walked away from. They could enjoy the scullery or the harvesting fields for all I cared. I returned to my work and enjoyed a few hours of peace and quiet as the numbers lulled me into a false sense of normalcy. But not much later, when the market below should have been buzzing and humming along like normal, voices began to carry across a large open space. Shouts of shock and disbelief rang out, and I could hear work abandoned as people quickly exited the square. I got up and looked out my window. Groups of people were running toward the Jewish house of worship, pointing, yelling, and excitedly discussing something of great interest. I didn't have Marcus to lean on to gather the latest gossip for me, so I let my curiosity guide me downstairs and out the door to follow behind the rush of people. As I approached their temple, I could hear a man's voice carrying over the noise of the crowd. I could tell he was either a raving lunatic or someone of great importance to these people, as he was giving them a verbal assault like I had never heard from the mouth of a Jew. I pushed numerous haggard people out of my way to get a better view of what was happening. I could see other Roman guards doing the same thing from other angles in the crowd. My first assumption was right. The Jewish elders stood off to the side, seemingly incapacitated by some crazy man in the temple market. The market. What a complete disaster. Tables were turned end over end. Birds, goats, and other animals were screeching, bleating, and squawking as vendors chased them up and down the temple stairs. Money lenders were on their knees, hurriedly grabbing at the coins from their tables that now littered the floor, two of them scrapping over who some of the coins belonged to. But the crowd didn't seem to see any of that. They were staring in awe at this insane man ranting and raving about the temple being his house and calling those very vendors and moneylenders evil. You could see on the frozen faces of the Jewish leaders absolute hatred of this man. Before they could break from their stupor, the man left the temple stairs and disappeared. The Roman guards attempted to follow him, but the press of the crowd prevented them from keeping up with him. As the crowd began to disperse, some Jews near me started talking about the man. I walked closely to hear what they knew. They mentioned his name was Jesus, and that he was the very man that entered the gates on a donkey just a day ago. Wow! I felt like those people would revere anyone if they thought that crazy man was some kind of hero. They began talking about what this Jesus and his disciples had been doing across the region, claiming the men had performed miracles and healed the sick and lame. A charlatan, that's what he was. One of the men in the group started talking about the events at the gate, and I swear I heard him say something about Romans in attendance. But at that same moment, a Roman guard approached me and drew my attention away. With the respect he should afford me as his superior, the guard suggested I leave the streets, as it could be dangerous for Roman citizens to be in the Jewish quarter amidst this upheaval. He'd already heard rumors of other events that these Jewish radicals may be planning. He escorted me back to my door and bid me good day. I stood there staring at the market outside my home as the remaining vendors came back to their carts and wares. There was a sense of foreboding among them. In hushed tones and stolen glances my way, I heard discussion of packing up and leaving the city until this was over, because they didn't want what happened at the temple to happen here. Better to lose a day's wages than a month's worth of product to a raving lunatic, they said. I admit at that moment my indignancy outweighed my better sense. I stormed over to my space in the market square that my shops occupied. The old man and his wife that ran my shop were shuffling around, backs bent, seemingly trying to hide from other eyes in the market. It only took observation to see that they were thinking the same as the other shopkeepers. I stepped up to them and informed them of the consequences of not showing up to work for me, reminded them of the benefit of being my shopkeepers and of the things it afforded two old people without any other prospects for a decent income. With a tremble in his voice, the old man assured me they would be there to perform their duties as arranged. As I made my way back home, I made sure to inform other shopkeepers that the men that they served would expect them there as well. I broke up conversations about plans to shirk duties and had harsh words for groups that seemed to be conspiring together. I arrived back home more angered than I would have thought I could have been when I set out earlier just to satisfy my curiosity. I had tolerated these Jews just as something I had to deal with to do business in this city. I'd put up with all the rules and requirements. I'd even gotten them trusting my Roman-owned shops and buying my goods. But if they continued on this path of upsetting the business of this city, the page would turn. Do what you want in your own homes, in your own places of worship, but don't you dare think to hurt my bottom line. And I couldn't think of where in the world Marcus had gotten himself to. The day was drawing on and he still hadn't returned. I knew Jerusalem was a large city, but there were only so many places good Romans would go. He didn't have to check the alleyways and dirt roads of the Jewish quarters. They wouldn't deign to be seen among that rabble, or would they? I struggled to recall what that man in the crowd had said, something about Romans in attendance at the gates. Not my people, surely not members of my household. But that might explain why Marcus had not returned yet. If I were to find out that my shops and my people were being impacted by this rabble-rousing Jew on a donkey, I would ensure he had the might of Rome to answer to. Rome would put him back in his place, and my life would return to normal. Good profits, loyal workers, honored name. I just wanted the day to be over. I wanted to be greeted by Marcus as usual, to hear the market bustling along like normal, and to not ever think about this Jew named Jesus again. I sat down on a plush chair and kicked off my sandals. Propping my feet up on a nearby ottoman, I attempted to rub the tension out of my forehead. It would all be behind me if everything could just get back to normal.
I was so grateful I left Hannah at the camp with some of the older ladies. Mary had shared with me early that Jesus would be returning from the temple to address some issues that he had noticed the night before. You could tell in her voice that she was concerned just what that would look like. Despite our trepidation, Mary and I and a small group of other women chose to follow him back into the city. We knew that there would be times when he and Peter and the others would need us to serve them or the people that they were ministering to. As long as I knew Hannah was safe, I was willing to follow him wherever he asked me to go. How could I not? He had brought us into this family that we wouldn't otherwise have been afforded. He loved my daughter, and he saw value in both of us as an extension of the work he was doing. But this was the first time I would experience real fear as part of his contingency. When he walked up those temple steps, you could see it in his eyes. He was indignant, staring at the Jewish elders and the leaders as he took each step to the lenders' tables that sat at the front of the temple market. All they did was to stare back at him as if to challenge him. I saw more than one of them glance at the Roman guards around the square and smirk. You could see that they wanted him to make a scene. None of us expected just how much they would get what they wanted. But I would bet that none of them would have known what it was going to look like. Without a word, he walked up to the closest table. The man behind it sensed that something about Jesus' countenance, and he just stood there to respond. It probably didn't help that there was a large crowd watching his every move. Jesus looked down at the table, then to the ledger that the man had left sitting open. I was already learning just how astute Jesus was. He could observe things in us that would take years, if ever, for us to become aware about on our own. Standing there at the table, he did the same to that man. He threw the palms of his hands onto the table and wrapped his thumbs around the edge. To the shock of the man and to us in the crowd, he lifted and he flipped the table over and off the stairs. The crowd parted quickly as the table came crashing to their feet. Coins scattered across the floor of the market, and Jesus kicked many of them into the dusty corners as he walked to the next table and to the next, knocking them over, overturning baskets, shattering jars, and breaking the locks of cages. The place erupted into a cacophony of sound and movement, animals and people in utter chaos. Leaders, elders, guards, all yelling and trying to calm down the crowd. To my shock, nobody stopped him. Not the vendors, not the money lenders, the temple elders, or even the Roman guards. As the crowd grew quiet again, Jesus pulled deep breaths from his lungs, and he began railing against the treatment of his Father's house. He called the men in the market thieves and liars. He looked at the elders with daggers in his eyes, their faces growing redder by the second. Mary and I grabbed each other. She had known this man for so long. She knew what he was capable of, and she still seemed taken aback at his brazenness. All I knew in that moment was that he wasn't the safe place I thought he was. If he was willing to do this so publicly with all of his enemies watching, I didn't know if I could continue to expose myself or Hannah to what this would inevitably reap. As Jesus descended the stairs, I saw John and Peter grab him and run off. With the size of the crowd gathering, he disappeared quickly enough to confound the Roman guards that stood around the square. Mary and I snuck through a nearby alley and down a side street to get away from the chaos. As we ran, while gasping for breath, I begged Mary to help me understand what I had just witnessed. I told her I thought Jesus was a kind, gentle, loving man that preached messages of hope and restoration to those of us who felt like those things were outside of our grasp. He was here to make our lives so much better than they were. He had said that he loved us. I couldn't see his love for us in that moment. Everything he did just seemed very selfish, if not completely crazy. He knew what kind of risk that would be. There in front of all those Romans and the elders of the faith, what was he thinking? Mary squeezed my hand and promised to talk about all of this once we returned to camp. I didn't argue with her, for at that moment, I really wanted to have Hannah in my arms again. I can't believe I was so selfish to be a part of that chaos and leave her all alone. What would have happened to her if I had been arrested for being one of his followers? Mary seemed to read my concerns on my face. She paused our exodus from the city just long enough to embrace me and assure me that Hannah and I would be fine. I appreciated the gesture from my friend, but it was hard to take it to heart. I was not ready for that kind of risk. In fact, I sure didn't sign up for it when I started following him. But what would I do? I had sold everything we owned to follow him. I was beginning to feel like I had made the worst decision of my life.
A Holy Week story, When the Human and the Holy Collide, is written and produced by Kelly Duke with editing and oversight by Philip Larson. Vocal talents provided by Brett Bauer, Tony Gregory, Randy Kemp, and Mary C. Bruce. Theme music written by Danny Lee, Andy Dixon, Scott Garnan, and Stephen Gray, and performed by the West Metro Worship Collective. Background instrumentals provided by Higher Power. Discussion and insight questions by Ryan Abernathy. Sound editing by Ron Duke.